Today, I am so excited to welcome Craig Lindsay, a corporate finance pioneer with over 30 years of experience in investment banking and business development for early-stage resource and renewable energy companies. Craig has the Bachelor of Commerce from our local UBC here, but he also has an MBA from Dalhousie University and holds the Chartered Financial Analyst designation. Craig is CEO of Lonestar Lithium, and he's a director for a few companies, including Revolve Renewable Power, Excellon Resources, Electric Royalties, VR Resources, and Silver North Resources. In today's conversation, we are going to cover the world of renewable energy, including wind, solar, and battery storage. And we're going to see how it's applied on a real-world basis through some of the companies that Craig is both an investor and a director in. So, Craig, thanks for joining us today on Coastal Front.
Andrew, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. Well, let's just jump into the category that I'm the least familiar with today, which is wind energy. I'm going to start by laying out some statistics for our listeners and viewers, because when I started looking at these numbers, I was actually quite astonished at how big wind is. In fact, the first thing that caught my attention is that wind production annually produces more electricity than solar, which I was surprised to hear. So the first data point I thought would be interesting to highlight is that last year in 2023, the global wind industry installed a record 117 gigawatts of new capacity, a 50% increase over 2022. And that today, the offshore part, which we can maybe spend some time talking about, only represents 9% of total production, but apparently it's growing quite fast and is projected to be 20% of total production over the next 5 years. And finally, the total electricity generated from wind energy in 2023 surpassed 2,100 terawatts. And I believe 1 terawatt is equal to, is it 100,000? No, a million?
Maybe. Million.
Is it a million? Thank you. 1 million watts of power. Yeah. So maybe the first question for you is, give us a sense as to why are we seeing this massive rise in wind energy globally?
Well, from a renewable perspective, wind has always been one of the most efficient forms of renewable energy. It's more efficient than solar, which is why it's had this growth. And we haven't seen a lot of it in North America, to be honest. Any of your listeners will spend time, say, in Palm Springs. You're driving into Palm Springs, there's all sorts of wind turbines as you drive through there. You do see them in the U.S. and Canada, but it's really amazing when you fly into, say, Amsterdam. Look out the window of the plane, and the ocean is there are fields of wind turbines. And so it is coming to our shores because it is so efficient, and it's particularly efficient in an offshore area. So we're talking away from mountains, away from anything that can disturb wind flows, and you are definitely going to see a lot more of that growth here in the U.S. and Canada going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note of offshore, and as I pointed out earlier, that today offshore only represents 9% of total production, but expected just in the next 5 years to reach 20%. What are the kind of main advantages, in your view, of having offshore wind, out in the ocean versus onshore? Well,
I think that the big thing is for offshore, and the reason it's so popular is because there's no obstructions to the wind whatsoever. So you're still going to get fluctuations in the wind, variances. So wind energy is not, wind is not blowing 24 hours a day, but it is blowing generally. They put these turbines in places where there is consistent wind flows. It does blow both at night as well as during the day. So that's a big advantage over solar. You're getting 24-hour energy. And again, just being offshore, you don't have any obstruction to the wind. So that the wind flows are just more consistent than you would have in onshore locations. Okay. And that's really the big advantage between onshore versus offshore wind.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, one of your companies you're involved with has some wind production down in Mexico. Do you want to maybe talk about that a little bit so we can understand? Because, when you read this data and in articles like The Economist, it's always fascinating to read the sort of macroeconomic data. But I always love to tie it back into a real world application. So maybe you could tell us about one of your projects, just so people can understand on a like grassroots level how this works.
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess with Revolve Renewable Power, which is we have operations in Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, and we're a developer of utility scale wind and solar projects as well as battery storage. So these are 100 megawatt and up projects.
Okay. 100 megawatt is like the threshold to be considered utility level?
It is. Generally in the industry, you look at 100 megs and up. And most of the wind projects are 200, 300, 400 megawatt projects. There are certainly larger ones, and there are definitely smaller ones. We have a very small scale 3 wind turbine operation in Medicine Hat in Canada. But down in Mexico, it's all utility scale, 100 megawatt and up. And this business got its founding on a bunch of old mining claims that these guys went out and looked for silver on them, found nothing, and were standing out there kind of going, what are we going to do with this land? And one of the guys was like, I don't know, but it's pretty windy out here.
Right.
And that was
it's like, look at that kid flying that kite.
It was literally that kind of thing. And they kind of went, well, we should check into this. So they took one of those projects. They invested about $1.7 million US in that project. And within 2 years, they had got it to a ready-to-build stage. So it was ready to turn the lights on, build it, ready to turn the lights on, sold it for about $17 million US.
Is that right? Wow.
And I knew one of the founders of this company, a guy by the name of Roger Norwich, who was a business partner of mine on a gold mining deal. And he came to me. They wanted some liquidity, told me about the story. I knew nothing about renewable energy. I had spent a lot of time in Mexico over the years doing various mining deals, but certainly didn't know that space. And when he told me that story, I was hooked.
Right.
So these are projects that are in the east side of Mexico and in Monterrey, around in that area where there's a lot of nearshoring. So these plants are close to manufacturing operations that are looking for green energy to power their plants. And in Mexico, you get a lot of almost all of the power in Mexico is controlled by something called the CFE. It's the government electrical grid.
Yeah.
Most of it's coal-fired, oil-fired, and they want to use as much of their capacity as possible to provide electricity with their existing infrastructure of coal and gas. Renewable energy is one that's going to get added to the mix because there's this demand, and a lot of it does come from foreign multinationals who are saying, look, we want to set up, these are the Ford Motor plants, the Volkswagens of the world that are very large users of electricity, and they're kind of demanding renewable energy as part of the grid. And that's helped really drive things, the growth and demand for renewable energy in Mexico.
Okay.
In particular, and failures on the grid and a lack of ability to provide an appropriate level of energy from their existing modes of electricity.
Yeah,
and what's big there? It's sunny and there's a lot of wind.
Right.
So they don't have hydro, of course. Here in BC, 100% of our grid is hydro.
Yeah.
And that is changing, but they don't have that, so they have to rely on these dirty.
Well, they sure have a lot of sun down there, as we know.
Yeah.
We had Keith Neumeier on our podcast a few months ago with First Quantum Minerals, and to talk about your point of reliability of the grid in their 2 mining projects, 2 of their projects they have, 2 of their locations. They built their own. One was actually, funny enough, hydro. It was quite an unusual situation, and the other one, I think, was solar, if I recall. I can't recall exactly, but that was an issue they had. Is that the reliability of the Mexican, electric grid system wasn't as dependable as we would anticipate in a jurisdiction like British Columbia. So I understand that's another advantage, as you just highlighted.
Oh. Very significant. So we can go into a mining operation that is operating off the grid, and it's critical for them to have a consistent source of electricity. And what our company does, we go in at our cost and install solar, not wind typically in these situations, for smaller scale, but it's solar. And then we have a battery storage system attached to it.
Yeah.
And that battery storage, if it's not being consumed during the day, it goes into the batteries so that they can draw that power down at night when there's no sun. And it's either a supplement to their power that's delivered through the CFE, or it can actually replace that. And, it depends on... Mexico is a unique market because they don't have standard pricing across the country. So some areas are better for this than others.
I see.
But typically, depending on where they are, we can go in and offer a 30 to 40% savings in electricity by us installing a solar system and battery storage system for them at our cost.
Yeah.
So there's no money up front, and we're going to cut down your electrical costs by 30 or 40%, and you're going to be able to meet some of these ESG goals that a lot of companies, believe in them or not, a lot of companies are striving for.
Right. Okay.
So that's another feature of this thing for companies like
Yeah, so a lot of wins. Yeah, with the wind.
Yes.
Now, the power costs have been dropping substantially over the past decade. We've seen about a 60% drop in the cost of wind power. Do you think this is the primary driver as to why we saw last year alone a 50% increase in new capacity versus the year before? Or do you think there are other factors that are causing such a big surge in new wind production?
No, I think there is a variety of factors. Obviously price coming down is a big thing. Wind turbines, there's always, and it's the same thing with solar. A big issue is the recyclability of these things, and they're doing a lot of work on that. So the more work that they do where turbines, when they at the end of life, can be recycled, drives part of the story.
Yeah.
You would have heard a lot about people who have a strong environmental bent, and frankly, we all do. Birds and bats are a big thing with wind turbines, and you go into certainly an onshore wind turbine, and you can see it's an unfortunate situation what happens to birds and bats with these things. So what do? They're cutting down. They have periods where, like bat migration, where they will just shut the turbines down for a couple of weeks. They're also doing some really unique things that are helping drive the demand for wind turbines. They take, if there's 3 turbines on one of these things, they'll put on one of those turbines, and this sounds like a super simple idea, but they basically paint a black stripe on it. And as that turbine goes around, that is becoming amazingly effective at deterring bats and birds.
Wow.
So things like that are helping solve some of these challenges that have been a hindrance to the expansion of wind, and are going to address some of the environmental concerns that people have around it. So there are other things that are helping drive the demand for wind.
Now, one of the things I read recently was the size of these turbines are quite enormous, and from a transportation perspective, they're quite a challenge. When you look at the projects you've had through Revolve Renewable, I mean, are these blades, these kind of blades you see in places like the Netherlands where they're like, 4 and 5 truck lengths long, or how they are, huh?
Yep, they are.
So where do they get manufactured, and how do you get them into a field in Mexico? I mean, that must be a real challenge.
So I have to clarify that what we do, we're a developer of these projects. So we take them from a greenfield site.
Yeah.
So, hey, we found a place that's got a lot of wind. It's good. And we go through the permitting process. We get power purchase agreements in place. We get interconnection to the grid. We get it to what's called a ready-to-build stage. And then large renewable energy players come in.
Oh, I see.
And they purchase the project from us at that point.
Okay.
So there's
and then it's their job from their end to implement.
It's their job to do all of that.
Right.
To be honest, we just don't deal with that.
Yeah.
But again, going back to the economics of this thing, you typically sell a wind project at $40,000 a megawatt.
Okay.
Wind, $50,000 US a megawatt. We just sold a solar project last year. It was a 1 gigawatt project. So you do the math on that, and that project, those payments come in over time as it gets developed. But there's a big return for us just being these so-called developers. And there's a huge market. If you get to, in Mexico or elsewhere, if you get a project to ready-to-build stage, there is a lineup of buyers. So these are guys like Iberdrola is a big Spanish company that's heavily involved. Siemens, GE is heavily involved in both wind and solar. There's a lot of institutional investors. You may have heard that Macquarie just bought a significant minority stake in D.E. Shaw, their renewable energy group in the United States, $1.7 billion US they invested. So there is a huge demand for these projects when they get to the ready-to-build stage.
Right.
And what what might be of interest to your listeners, instead of waiting until they get to a ready-to-build stage and there's a lineup of buyers and it's a very competitive market on the buying end of things.
Yeah.
Guys are starting to the operators of these things, the institutional investors, are coming in at a much earlier stage. So they're saying, okay, you've got the greenfield site, you've got your leases in place,
right?
You've done your wind studies. We're going to buy in now at $50,000 a megawatt. We're going to take over, and when it gets into, you're going to be paid out that $50,000 per megawatt as the project gets through its various stages.
Right.
So they're committing at a much earlier stage, and then they don't have to deal with all of the competition. Because
so it's actually very similar to the mining industry. Like it's in the sense of like, you know, you've got maybe you've got a location where you've done some exploration and you're past the early stage exploration. You're into kind of a development stage and you align with a much larger producer who wants to get in early, lock it in, know they've got future production capacity coming from that location. And then for the junior, they've got access to capital now that they might not have had.
Yes, with the only caveat being it's very similar to that, but yeah. I've been in the junior mining industry for years, and at the early end of the game where we're out doing early stage exploration and trying to get a discovery hole and then trying to grow that to a resource and then getting a PEA in place. And all you tell your investors is, don't worry, we're going to get it to 1 million ounces plus and 100,000 ounces of gold a year, and Barrick's going to buy you. That's a rarity. It is a rarity.
Yeah.
So the difference with
this
our
is
business model is when you get to that you get to that stage, these things are sold.
Okay.
So it's
a lot more reliable.
It's a similar model, but you're right. That's a good word. It's more reliable.
Yeah.
And frankly, the returns are much greater and the turnaround is a lot faster.
Wow.
I mean, I've been in mining projects that people have had the first drills on them in the 70s and they're still not in production, but it's the greatest story in the world.
Right.
Whereas I can turn a project around from greenfield site to ready to build in anywhere from 2 to 4 years. 3 to 4 years is probably more realistic versus 10, 20, never.
Yeah.
So this is why
This is why you drank the Kool-Aid.
My focus
totally.
To this whole renewable thing.
Yeah. Wow. Well, let's now jump to solar. Again, for those listeners, what's really fascinating is I thought that solar was going to be a higher production than wind. It's not yet, but I think it's going to surpass it just based on the growth stage that we're at. Just for reference, currently there's about 600 gigawatts of capacity being added every year to the solar industry. And just to give some comparison, in 2004, there was only 1 gigawatt of solar added to the global capacity 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And now we're doing 600 gigawatts in a year. I mean, it's a 600 fold increase over the last 20 years. The total amount of global production of electricity from solar is 1,600 terawatts, which represents about 6% of total electricity demand. So again, to give some comparison, in the wind sector, that total production is 2,100 terawatts, and solar is 1,600. But it seems like it's catching up pretty quickly. And I believe that part of that is just through the fact that the cost of solar production has really plummeted. It's really gone down a lot. Of course, most of this is produced in China. Another interesting fact is that if you take all the panels all around the world, solar panels, both industrial scale and even smaller, residential ones and you put them all in one space, they only actually occupy half the space of the country of Wales.
Right.
So it's actually, we think of these massive fields, but it's actually on a global level, it's not that much space that they take up as of right now. What also is interesting is that there's been continued forecasts by these large energy agencies and global agencies where they've got forecasts of how fast solar will grow. Mm-hmm. And for the last 2 decades, basically the actual installations of solar have surpassed the forecast by like 3 times. Mm-hmm. So it's growing at a faster rate than anybody's been able to sort of predict. And this, again, most of this data is coming from a great article I read in The Economist, but supposedly we should see solar production be the largest contributor towards electricity production by the mid-2030s, and by the mid-2040s should be the largest production source for all energy, not just electricity. On a more localized level, the provincial government recently just implemented a program where they provide rebates now for solar installation and battery storage, which we'll be getting to in a minute, which is a 50% dollar-for-dollar rebate up to $10,000 spent on a residential installation and up to $50,000 in a commercial installation. So maybe we'll start by just, again, open-ended question. What are you seeing in your space as to why solar is having such a huge surge in popularity at this stage?
Well, here's an interesting fact, because you're a fact guy, clearly. I am not, even though I'm a CFA. But around 1999, a guy did a study. There's 975 trillion kilowatts of solar energy that's produced by the sun annually. That is enough to power, at the time, all of the electrical needs of the United States 300 times over.
Yeah.
And the solar fields at the time, it would take 150 kilometers by 150 kilometer space to provide that power. I looked at that last night and I was like, let's update the numbers a little bit. Same amount of power being produced by the sun, but because of the solar has become more efficient, it's enough to power about 600 times the amount of energy consumed in the United States. And
wow.
Because of efficiencies, it's down to about 125 kilometers by 125 kilometers. It's basically something about the size of West Virginia. It's about a tenth the size of Arizona.
Wow.
Most people may not know where Wales is, so I'm using some U.S. things. Everyone knows where Arizona is, but it's remarkable.
That is remarkable. Those are some amazing numbers.
Yeah, that's really what's driving this thing. It's a huge resource. What are the challenges? It's only it's only there during the day, and it's only there when there's no clouds, etc. So that's why it's not nearly as efficient a resource as wind. But you've nailed it with the price of panels coming down.
Yeah.
That used to be a big barrier to entry. Now, throw out a number of like a 500 megawatt coal-fired plant might be about $1.5 billion to build. It's about $1.8 billion for a 500 megawatt. That's the numbers that they throw around. I think that's at the high end. And it's about $500 million for a 500 megawatt gas-fired plant. So
gas-fired.
Gas. So gas is much, much cheaper. But given the fact that these prices are coming down, you're able to deliver solar power to customers. And there's a few entities that have come out with these costing for energy, different types of energy, and the price. And Lazard is a big producer of some studies, and all the prices of wind and solar are definitely coming down, and that's just relative to coal and gas. Here in British Columbia, it's an interesting story in that. Well, let's look at Canada. I think the average price in Canada per kilowatt hour is around $11 or 12 cents. It's significantly lower in BC because of hydro. We're 100% hydro.
Yeah.
It's 4 times that amount in the Northwest Territories.
Yes.
So the cheapest places in Canada for power, which, push away from bringing in solar power or wind, are BC, Manitoba, Quebec, big, cheap sources of hydro power. But some of these where power in Alberta is quite expensive on a relative basis to BC because they don't have as much. They don't have the hydro.
But Alberta, if I recall, has more solar production across our country than any other province by a country mile.
Yes, and that's why solar is big there.
Yeah,
because they don't have an alternative renewable energy source.
Right.
We've got hydro. They don't.
How much of that do you think was driven by, I don't know the data, but by the former NDP government, which I suspect would have been offering quite a few rebates and benefits to rolling out solar versus the current United Conservative Party of Alberta?
In Canada right now, they're offering for utility scale developments, you had a certain number, they're actually offering a 30% investment tax credit. So if you're
at a federal level.
At a federal level,
okay, yeah, because my data was only provincial.
$100 million in capex to build a solar farm, which is going to get you about 60 megawatts of power probably. You're going to get $30 million back from the government. So it's a big incentive to build. Challenge, you mentioned Alberta. They actually, late last year, they suspended approving any new solar projects in the province for about 6 months while they did a study. And they've come out since then, and they are basically looking at the importance of agricultural uses for land.
Yeah.
Because solar takes up, they don't want to just use agricultural land for solar.
Right.
So they want solar to mix well with agricultural land, and then tourism. So they've got these buffer zones around that they're recommending around provincial parks, and out of the view shed on the foothills of the Rockies are a big thing.
See.
They don't want wind turbines, and they don't want solar fields that are getting in the way of your viewscape. But now that's in their rear view mirror, and they've made that decision. And there's still some uncertainty as how much land is going to be excluded from development. And if you talk to some people, they'll say anywhere from 67 to about up to 75% of the province. But in reality, if you talk to the government, they're focused on view sheds in the foothills and around parks.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
So it's two thumbs up. And we've actually, Revolve Renewable Power has just acquired a little project there that we're going to build ourselves. And it's a 30 megawatt solar project outside of Edmonton.
Okay.
And instead of taking that to ready to build and selling it off, we're actually going to build it ourselves, because a 30 megawatt project is going to only cost us in the region of $45 to $50 million. So with you finance these things, $50 million, you got to come up with 10% in equity, so $5 million for that, and the remainder is in a combination of long-term debt and this investment tax credit,
right,
which is a financeable.
Which you said is about 30%?
30%.
Yeah, okay.
They have the same product down in the U.S. The only difference in the U.S. with the tax credits for financing things like solar versus Canada. In Canada, you can't. In the U.S., you can take that tax credit, and there's a big industry selling it off to third-party investors.
Oh, is there really like a free market to?
Yeah, well, you'll
so
come
American.
I'm simplifying things, but it's a $30 million tax credit, and you're going to get that a year after you build your plant. I'm going to buy. I know that plant, or that solar field is being built, so I'm going to buy that $30 million off of you for $26.5 million, and I'm going to make that delta over that 2-year period, giving you some money up front to finance your project, and I'm going to get it in the back end and make that turn. That's not quite the right math, but that's the thinking. In Canada, that investment tax credit, it's not a mature enough market yet. It just comes right back to the developer. But that's helping drive this big push in solar.
In solar. Now, as you know, one of the companies I've recently launched is called Honey Badger Charging, and our current model right in the early days is to focus on installations into multi-residential family buildings. We're focused right now on Metro Vancouver. And as we've delved into this, we're starting to realize very quickly on a very, practical level how limited the grid system is for hydro. In fact, we've talked with the folks at Hydro. I've watched some of their very long-winded and boring podcasts. I find them interesting. Most people probably find them boring. But there's no problem right now in BC, especially with Site C Dam coming on board, with respect to the amount of hydroelectricity we can produce. There's a lot of production capacity available in front of us here. And even those massive transmission lines you see as you're driving across the highways across British Columbia have tons of capacity. The issue is predominantly here in Metro Vancouver and the limitation of the grid. And it makes me think that's probably one of the reasons why the provincial government has implemented this rebate program for, I guess, call it localized solar production.
Right.
And so when I think in solar, a lot of people I think of like these massive fields out in, like you said, in Alberta, out in farmers' fields where there's just huge fields of solar. But I do wonder if there's some merit to having almost like a decentralized solar production where, look at all these buildings that we're sitting around where the rooftops are flat and you could easily throw an array of 40, 50, 60, 100 modules on top of that building. And not only are you using a space that's already built that no one's going to really care about, but you're also generating right at the source. So it takes demand off the local grid. Yeah. Any thoughts around that?
Well, it's a great idea. And I like your thinking, but you get a 50, 60-story building downtown. The actual footprint up top, it's not very large.
Right. But what about maybe like some of these industrial parks you see out in areas like Surrey or Langley?
That's what our business is. We call it distributed power generation. We do that in Mexico, and we're starting to bring that into the U.S. and Canada.
Okay.
And we will go into a Ford Motor Company.
Yes.
And we will install the panels on the roof.
Yeah.
That power never goes onto the grid. We call it behind the meter business. It's great for us because it provides kind of a 15 to 18% return for our shareholders.
Yeah.
It's at no cost to GM, and it's providing power that doesn't when as soon as you try and connect onto the grid with BC Hydro or the CFE down in Mexico or anywhere else, there's this big interconnection issue. The cost can be very high and it gets very complicated, the permitting side of it. When it's behind the meter, it's like it all goes right back. So what you're talking about is quite interesting. And there's a lot of movement towards the concept of community solar. I can't speak to it very effectively because I'm not in that business, but it's going into smaller communities where, look, instead of relying on the grid, we're going to put in our own little community solar grid to supply this residential development or this industrial park. So a developer of an industrial park can go and build a battery storage system, a solar system, likely not wind, and use that to power 100% of the, not just one user, but a multitude of industrial users or a whole community of homes.
Yeah.
And it's bringing that power right close to the source.
Wow.
The only way you can really do that here in Vancouver is getting people to put it on their roofs.
Right.
And because of this, this hydropower issue that we have, that's cheap and plentiful. I understand what you're talking about, the challenge of getting that power through the grid here in Vancouver, but it's difficult given how cheap hydropower is. So
we've run the back of the napkin in math, and even with these rebates, it's hard to kind of justify an investment in BC because, as you highlighted, the power already that we can get, which is renewable as it stands, being hydro, is so cheap.
Yeah,
I can see why places like Mexico, where their alternative is burning, if you have an environmental slant to this, Mexico is a logical one because the alternative is burning oil and gas,
right?
And their cost of power is far higher there, I believe.
Yeah.
Like what can just give some perspective. I know like power costs here in BC. The upper end of the residential will be like 14 cents a kilowatt. Yeah. Lower end would be like maybe 6 or 7 cents kilowatt Canadian. So I guess that's roughly about, maybe like 10 cents to 5 cents USD. What is power cost down? I know you said it's not the same all across Mexico, but what kind of power costs are there down there?
Well, it'd be kind of triple that.
Is it really?
It really depends on where you are. There's not a fixed number. I could throw a bunch of different numbers, and it wouldn't really mean anything. But
it's definitely higher.
Yeah, because it's coal, and it's all carbon related, and it's expensive, and it's dirty.
Yeah. Craig, before we go into battery storage, do you have any opinions? You spent quite a bit of time working in your earlier part of your career in Asia and living over there. And as we know, China is the world's largest producer by a massive fact. I think it's like close to 90% of global production of solar panels, photovoltaic panels, and they call them modules, is produced in China. There's seems to be a growing sort of trade friction or spat going on between China and the United States, especially if Trump gets elected. China and Canada is having this, I think the latest was like there was a, canola oil tariff now on Canadian canola oil being exported to China. So do you see any headwinds in the solar industry right now, knowing that most of that solar production is being produced out of China? You've done lots of work in Asia over the years, or will the free market find its way through all this?
I think it'll be a non-issue.
Yeah.
I mean, I graduated from UBC in 1989, December of 1989. I took a little extra time to finish my degree, and I immediately went on a plane over to Asia, knocked on doors looking for work. And I arrived in Hong Kong the day of Tiananmen Square massacre.
Did you?
And that was Sunday, and I had a job. I was behind a desk by the Friday. So even in a terrible market, that's where I started my career. I've been very actively involved in kind of the Hong Kong Canadian business community over the years. Had a business there in the late 90s, around 2000, and the internet business that we built up. And so it was probably the best returning investment I ever had. We had a deal where we built up an online retailer of Asian language music and movies. I set up an office in Mumbai for Bollywood movies and Taipei for what we call Mando Pop, and then the Canto Pop and all the Hong Kong movies in Hong Kong. Had a distribution fulfillment relationship with DHL, got it up and running. It was the worst business model because the margins on a CD and a DVD in those days was 10, 12%. And we were trying to sell it to the Asian diaspora globally, who could go down to Richmond and buy it for pennies on the dollar. So it wasn't a good business model there, but it was the very peak of the e-commerce internet boom. And we sold our interest to a guy called Li Ka-shing, who was taking a company public called Tom.com at the time. We got back free trading shares in Tom, and it was to this day the best performing IPO on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. It was up 10 times in one day.
Wow.
It was an amazingly successful deal. But Hong Kong has changed. It's a very different place. China has changed. We all know about the economic, the political frictions. We all know about China and Taiwan. It's just a very different place than when I was young. At the same time, that part of the world is all about trade, money,
getting the deal done.
Entrepreneurialism, getting the deal done, money. So I hear what you're saying. I don't think it's going to have a material impact on the supply of
solar.
Okay. No, it's not going to impact.
Okay, great. Battery storage. Again, I'll just throw out some data to give the listeners and viewers some context. Last year, there was 90 gigawatts of battery storage installed, which was double of that of 2022. So it's kind of interesting to see a doubling of production in wind, a near doubling of production in solar, and also a doubling of production of battery storage. Global installed capacity of battery storage will need to rise from less than the 200 gigawatts that they're at right now as of last year to 5 terawatts by 2050. And that's a massive increase. If we were, and this is based on the assumption that we're trying to hit this net zero emissions, which I always find a bit, funny, comical, because I don't know how any of us are going to hit these numbers by 2030 or 2040, but 20 anything. But equally, just like the solar, the BC government locally has implemented a 50% rebate program. Same numbers, $10,000, so you get up to $5,000 back on a residential installation for your, Tesla Powerwall, and up to $50,000 or $25,000 back on a commercial application. Now, I know energy storage capacity and battery storage is a big thing for your company, for Revolve Renewable Energy. Again, taking it back down to a practical level as a company, what are you doing today in this space? What are you seeing happening, and what are you excited about?
Yeah, well, first let's explain what battery storage is, because a lot of people, unless they're lucky enough to own a Tesla, they may not understand what it is. And it's basically just a bunch of lithium-ion batteries that are put together. There's an inverter attached to them that takes the AC to DC, handles that conversion. And then there's a bit of a computer software that handles the integration of that unit. And it's battery storage. So you typically, when would you use battery storage? Often in the applications that we use it in, it's going into a market where there's a delta in the energy price. So the energy price during the day is one price, and at night it's much cheaper when demand is lower. So you'll buy that power off of the grid at night when the power is a low price, put it into your battery and fill up that capacity. And then during the day, when your customer could go and start drawing down on battery off of the grid at one price, you can sell it back to them at a much lower price, and that's where that battery savings is. Then, so you can do that. We sell those to, we have contracts with hotels, for instance, down in Mexico, where they have a very high demand for power during the day, lower at night, because they're powering all of these AC units during the day. And it's a good little business, again, a low return business. And those are smaller units. There's also much larger, these utility scale units, where there's 200, 300, 400 megawatt battery storage systems, and often they're attached to wind or solar. So you're powering up these batteries during the day, filling them up with energy when you're producing electricity from the sun, and then you're selling it, drawing it down during the night when there's no power coming off of your solar panel. So it's an integral part of often of a solar field or a wind turbine.
Yeah.
There's also I'm getting into the weeds here, but utilities will also, we've got one standalone battery storage project that's utility scale, happens to be in Utah, and that project you're going to be dealing with one of the utilities in the area that are just paying you a standby charge to have access to that battery storage. So whenever they have excess electricity on the grid that is not being used, they'll put it into your battery storage and then draw it down.
Really?
When they're not using it. So it's a very big
Never heard of that before.
business. It's not just the little Tesla pack that you've got
on your home.
Wall at your home.
Yeah. Craig, you also just mentioned a moment ago this idea of behind the meter concept, where you got electricity production coming from solar. It goes into a stored battery on site, doesn't even hit the grid. And so if there's a draw for that electricity in the evening, once the sun's gone down, you've captured that power if it hasn't been used during the day, and you've now can kind of release it in the evening. Is that correct?
That's correct. But a bigger piece in a place like Mexico, for instance, is when the power is much cheaper at night. So you'll use that power to fill up your battery.
I see.
And release it during the day when the grid is selling you at a much higher price.
Okay. So irrespective of whether you had solar or not, you can actually build a business model and make a profit just off of this concept.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Battery storage is a standalone
Wow, fascinating.
renewable energy kind of business.
Tell me a bit more about what's happening in the actual technology. I know there's this concept of, right now we have these lithium-ion batteries. There's talk of some different chemical mix-up that's changing, that maybe the prices will come down or they'll be able to store power for longer with less space. There's also these solid-state batteries. Do you have any perspective on how that industry is changing?
I don't, because I'm not a technical guy, but I will answer your question a little bit of a different way.
Sure.
I was in the uranium business for years, built up a uranium company and sold it to a company called Energy Fuels.
Yeah.
And nuclear is a huge piece of, the electrical grid going forwards. In my opinion, it's got to grow. It's got to expand. It's much safer than it used to be. But where I'm going with this, as a replacement to uranium in a nuclear reactor, thorium has been talked about for years, and thorium is all over the place. Huge deposits in the U.S. There's very big deposits in India. India has done a lot of work on these so-called thorium reactors, and when I sold my uranium company back in 2008, I spent a lot of time in India at that time talking to the government folks and some large companies that are involved in the nuclear industry there. And it was always, why do we need Canadian uranium? Because we've got this thorium technology and it's the next thing. Changing horses is very expensive. It's very slow moving. There's a whole industry around lithium and lithium batteries.
Right.
And switching gears it's going to take time.
Yeah.
And I think again, I'm not a scientist. I can't really tell you. I read all of the stuff that you do. It all sounds like magic. The solid state batteries, I'm like, oh my God, why am I in anything to do with lithium? When we got these solid state, it's going to crush us. But I don't think that's going to happen. And it will happen.
Yeah.
It may not happen at a pace that's going to change my life, and certainly not the trajectory of what we're doing at Revolve Renewable Power.
Yeah. So. Okay. No, that's a good answer. Kind of makes me think of the what we back in the old days when we were kids and Dad or Grandpa was in the front car and he had to light a cigarette and he'd put his little cigarette lighter. Yeah. Most of these young guys don't even know what that thing was for, right? And who would ever thought that here we are today, and that's still how we're using now. That's what we use to power our phones in our cars while we're driving, right?
It's great. Now we have changed where you can put your phone on somewhere in your car and magically I don't
charges,
have that in my car, but you're right.
That's lasted a lot longer than any of us would have expected.
Yeah. Like some things just haven't changed.
No.
They probably don't remember the days that I remember when I was tumbling around in the back of my mom's car when it wasn't like wear your seatbelt. There were no seatbelts.
There were no seatbelts.
It was just a full-on scramble with the kids. So
totally.
It's a different time.
Yeah. Okay, Craig. Well, to tie this all back, I mentioned you're involved in today, you've got a much longer history than what I've just described, but you've got a number of companies you're involved with, but two in particular. We've talked a bit about Revolve Renewable Resources. We haven't really talked too much about Lonestar Lithium. Maybe just to finish off, can you tie this world of wind, solar, and battery storage into what's happening with two of these companies you're quite excited about?
Yeah, well, really, I've been a lot of the last 15 years of my life, 20 years has been with junior mining companies going after gold, silver, lead, zinc, uranium. And again, this renewable energy thing, I'm not the greenest guy in the world. I don't have a green car, but I want the world to be a better place for my children. I actually do believe in the benefits of cleaner energy. Renewable energy, I don't see it ever replacing. Like there's a big thing down in the United States, and it's a big political football about oil and carbon-based fuels versus renewable energy. These things, it's not a binary one or the other. These things it's just over time, renewable energy is going to become a bigger part of the mix. I'm not a guy saying no to carbon. We need it to meet the world's energy needs, but there is this mix. So I'll say that, and I've kind of bought into this, and my exposure professionally, I took a company public called Electric Royalties, which trades on the TSX Venture Exchange.
Oh, right. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that one. Yeah.
That company it's a royalty company. We have 40 plus royalties and growing on commodities that are in the battery metal space. So lithium is one of them, copper, tin. There's a whole range of metals that go into the whole electrification system. So we are heavily involved in that company. We've got Revolve Renewable Power. You mentioned Lonestar Lithium, which is a private company, and I spend my time down in Texas picking up leases on this company is going after lithium brines in something called the Smackover Formation in Texas, which is the highest grade lithium brines in North America. Obviously, lithium is, it's a big, it is what you need for all of your electrical vehicles out there. It's funny, I'm down in Texas all the time. But in Texas, about 5% of the cars that are sold are electric vehicles, whereas, in Washington State, 20+%. Yeah. There's probably 11 or 12 states in the United States that by 2035, 100% of the cars being sold have to be electric vehicles. I think we have the same thing here in BC and Quebec with some targets around electric vehicles. In Texas, no one wants to drive electric vehicles. It's all pickup trucks, and it's a different world down there, but they got a lot of lithium, and they've caught on to that. So that's a big focus of what I'm doing, where you're bringing up these lithium brines from deep in the ground. You're extracting the lithium from the brine, which water, salty water, and then once the lithium is out, you re-inject it back into the ground.
So it's a recycled style of system.
Yeah, it's a much smaller footprint than an open pit hard rock uranium mine in Australia. It's a much smaller footprint than the salars that you have down in South America and Chile and Argentina. It's friendly in that it's a small footprint. All of that water that comes out, it's just re-injected. It doesn't go anywhere else. And there's a lot of interest in this area because the lithium brine grades that we get are kind of 300 to 500 milligrams per liter, whereas up in Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan, you get grades of kind of 50 milligrams up to maybe top end 125. And in mining, the whole concept is grade is king. And why do I like that versus going and exploring for gold? Well, as I talked about, to take a gold project from 0 to 100, it can take years and years. Whereas these lithium brines, it's not as fast and it's not as cheap as getting, you drill for oil and you hit it and you're pumping and cash flowing the next day. Yeah. It's longer than that, but it's a heck of a lot shorter, much easier to permit. Timelines are much lower than in a conventional mining industry. So I have an exposure to that as well. My focus is this whole green movement.
Yeah.
I do believe in it. It is the future.
Well, what a great opportunity to not only add shareholder value, make a profit, but also doing something for the environment at the same time. And it's just a total win all right around.
Yeah, it is. It is. And that's, I don't know if I have that bent to me totally, but that is part of why we're doing this.
Yeah.
Is trying to leave the world in a cleaner place. And we're well down that road with these companies we're involved in that we've been talking about today.
Great. And to finish off, going back to Revolve Renewable Power, is there any one project that you're currently involved or the company's currently involved with that you and the rest of the board and the management are excited about in particular that you want to highlight?
That's a great question. Everything's exciting to us. Mexico with a new government we've got in there with Claudia Sheinbaum, who's just come in. She's going to take over October 1st. She's got an environmental bent to it. We think that's going to help the growth of the renewable energy business, which has been a little bit challenging down in Mexico. Huge demand in the U.S. for this stuff, and if you build it, they will come. That's big. And then I'm really excited to be up here in Canada. So we've got exposure to a couple of run-of-river power projects here in BC. We've got exposure to a small wind farm in Alberta. Yeah. We have 2 solar developments in Alberta and Saskatchewan that we're working on. So growing this footprint throughout North America, being these 3 legs of Canada, the U.S. and Mexico. It's not one project. It's where the company's going. And it's I was just last week I was down in Mexico kind of for team meetings, and this company's got 25 people. They're all much younger than me, and they're electrical engineers, mechanical engineers. There's some environmental people. We got a big legal team down there because that's kind of a big part of the business, all the documentation, the power purchase agreement. And it's so much fun to be working with a young group of people who everything's a great idea. They're fully energized. And it's been great for me, who's kind of, I'm 58, I'm getting long in the tooth, and my kids are moving out of the house. And it's just fun to be back engaged with young folks who are excited about doing something good and making money. I mean, that's what the goal is. And
of course,
we got a company that's got a less than $20 million market cap on the TSX Venture Exchange, and it's got nothing but upside once people start to understand the metrics of what we're doing and what we've got, where we're going, how we're growing, and the people behind it. So it's fun.
Yeah, that's great.
It's great.
And I would assume, but I'll just confirm, are most of the companies you're involved with located here in Vancouver? They're headquartered here in Vancouver?
Well, the Mexican Revolve Renewable Power, oddly enough, our CEO is in Dublin.
Okay.
The operating team is in Mexico, Mexico City. And the other companies I'm involved in are based here in Vancouver.
And that's one of the things I always like to highlight. I mean, it's why we started Coastal Front is, culturally here in Canada, we seem to almost want to vilify success in business. And that's one of the reasons why we do the show is I like to tell these stories because, look, you're creating great businesses. They might not even have projects locally, but they're Vancouver-based companies that employ accountants and lawyers and other types of people that come are working in the city and paying taxes and creating jobs. So for that, I appreciate you do all the work that you do.
Well, investors who invest in these things, it's the guys who are selling the picks and shovels in our industry that often make the most. The lawyers, the accountants, etc. We have a lot of failures in our business. In our industry with junior venture capital, public markets, everyone's had a boatload of dogs in their portfolio where things just haven't worked out. Not for anything nefarious, just we're in a high risk, high reward business.
Industry,
And when things do work, they work out great. And as long as people are putting both shoulders to these projects and doing everything the right way. There's an amazing community here in Vancouver of entrepreneurs and junior public markets. Mining is a big thing, obviously, but a whole technology is huge, and they take big risks and provide potentially big rewards. But it is a big part of the economy here. And I would say it's interesting. I was down in Perth a couple of months ago, and when I was growing up in Vancouver, everyone would have a bumper sticker on the back of their car about lumber being the number 2 industry and mining the number 1 industry. We were proud of that resource base here in Vancouver. And we've kind of lost that. It's a dirty word. Whereas you go down to Perth and
they're proud of it.
They are so proud of it. They wear it on their shirt sleeves. You 100%. Go into a meeting with a guy and he's got the name of his company on his golf shirt. You don't see that here. Everyone's company names is outside on the the storefront name. We don't have that here. It's so nice to see. And you come back here and I kind of go, we're missing the boat there.
Well, we got to change that, right?
We do.
And that's why we do. That's why I started Coastal Front. So,
we appreciate the work that you're doing, letting us share our stories. It's a great and valuable tool for us. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, Craig Lindsay, Director of Revolve Renewable Energy, CEO of Lonestar Lithium, and Director for a number of local Vancouver startup, both resource and non-resource companies. Thanks for coming on Coastal Front today. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it, Andrew. Great to see you.
Thanks.